Okay, welcome back everybody. For the final section, we bring it back home, environmental law in our United States, right? From the EPA on down. Well, not really, we'll see. Okay, we'll start with the Clean Water Act, right? So if 1970 is kind of the year in your mind for when environmental stuff starts getting taken seriously, that's a pretty good rule of thumb, right? As the beginning of our postmodern era. Be a good place to put it. Okay, so what did this actually do? First, it put forth a regulatory framework. So there's a little bit here, right? So this is government speak for deciding who has what powers and who is responsible for what. And it seems like this would be like, a trivial thing to do, just, give it to somebody. Okay, but that's not really how the government works, right? In the government system of doing things, you only have the power to do stuff that you are specifically given the power to do, right? Here, in the world as like private citizens, I can go around and do whatever I want so long as there is like no law against it, right? So long as nothing prevents me from doing that. Government, it is exactly the opposite, right? At least the way that we do it here in the United States, right? These agencies only have the powers that they are specifically given, right? Specifically given by, ultimately, Congress, who gets its power from the people and the Constitution, right? But we'll come back to that in a moment, right? And there are many different federal agencies. We do not have time, and we don't care about getting into the whole framework of this, right? But there's a lot of different federal government agencies that do a lot of different things, and figuring out which of them is going to be responsible for what, and, who is going to have what exact powers to do what things is complicated, right? And that is part of what the Clean Water Act did, is to set this out, right? Varies a lot from state to state in terms of implementation. Okay, so if you are in, the state of New York, right, there's a lot of rain, there's snow, there's a ton of waterways, right, that flow a lot, right? It's totally different from regulating waterways here in Arizona, right, which is arid, a lot of seasonal stuff that is dry most of the time, but then it's a river seasonally and sometimes, but then it goes back to being dry. Okay, it's a totally different picture. Ultimately, the states are left to do this, right? Laid out a regulatory framework, right, that was workable with other agencies, assigned powers as needed, gave standards for wastewater, right? So you remember that picture we had from like the first or maybe second section, right, where you had like the power plant that was dumping waste into the pond, right? And it had like the fish with 3 eyes. Okay. Standards for that, like how dirty is okay and how dirty is too dirty. That's important. And then water quality standards for consumers, right? Effluent wastewater. So this term effluent, which we've maybe heard, right? Wastewater that is discharged, let's say, from a factory into either a river or ocean, right? A water of the United States, right? So now, because of this, there are standards for what you can dump. Before this was in place, there were no standards for like how dirty the stuff was. People essentially thought that whatever you put into the environment was diluted and could never have any effect on anybody, which is of course not true. We don't need to care about the details here, right? But it also established these different water quality parameters, right? So how safe is safe enough to drink? How safe is safe enough for other purposes? How safe is, slightly contaminated versus seriously contaminated, all that other stuff. Okay. Clean Air Act is another one from about the same time period. We're going to say 1970, right? Puts these air quality standards nationally, right? And unlike with things like outdoor waters, this one is going to be a lot more the same from place to place in a number of ways, right? You have air quality standards. Anything above that standard is not good. These are all the different pollutants that are ultimately regulated. We don't need to necessarily care about all the details here for now, but it also was a way of Congress giving power to the EPA to regulate air emissions, right? They don't just have the power to do whatever they want. They only have the powers that are specifically given to them by Congress, all right? Relatedly, right, here in Arizona, we have these vehicle emissions standards, right? So what Congress, which is elected by the people, comes together and passes legislation which gives power to the EPA and all these different federal agencies, which gives power to the state level agencies to give power to the county to tell you what to do. That's just how the chain of things kind of works, right? And you'll notice, right, we're kind of familiar with some of the things on here, right? Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, how much nitrous oxides and other stuff is coming out of the tailpipe. It is regulated for the purposes of improving air quality in our region, which tends to have very bad air quality, right? So if, you know, the next time you're doing this, if you're like annoyed by it and you're wondering who is to blame for like the fact that, you know, you can't get your car registered because of the emissions, it's this guy, right? And to be clear, right, annually, right, we're okay, but we have some specific really, really high ozone days, which are bad, and some specific days where particle pollution is really bad in the valley. In other words, our overall average for the whole year is okay, right? We get a passing score, but we get a really bad score when it comes to having certain days where the air pollution is extreme, right? Which is part of why this is in place. Another collective action solution to a collective action problem. These two, right, so the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act do run into some issues in terms of actually being able to solve the problem. Like what? Like, okay, if you are an environmental scientist for the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, right, which is like our state-level EPA, and you go out and you find a river that is horribly polluted, right, really nasty stuff, right? Well, figuring out where that pollution is coming from is not easy. Is really complicated, right? Figuring out who is to blame for that can be a really, really complicated thing. Why? Well, what it comes down to for a lot of it is that you have some sources of pollution that are down to a single point, right? Single point that produces the pollution. Like what? Like a pipe coming out of a factory, dumping things into the river, right? We would call this a point source of pollution, right? Or, you know, a ship that's dumping human sewage into the river or whatever, right? It's coming from a single point, so you can find ultimately a single source for it. Other sources are a lot harder to deal with, right? So if you have runoff from, you know, this whole system and series of all these farms spread out over a huge area, and the travel path of the water through the ground is really complicated, and each one of them is applying slightly different chemicals and fertilizers at different times of year, and parts of it get rain and parts of it don't. Okay. Then because it is a non-point source for the pollution, it can be really hard to nail down who is ultimately responsible. And so there are difficulties in actually implementing the ideal result, right? Which is being able to find who is responsible for the pollution and make them pay. Not like, you know, like that kind of make them pay, but like make them pay for the damage that they are doing, right? So that they pay the costs and they get the benefits. Instead of this whole thing where they get the benefits and other people pay the cost, right? Acid rain, going to be the last thing we're going to kind of look at as a lead-in to our final economic concept, right? So back in the 70s and 80s, this was much more of a problem. You talk to, I don't know, older folks, right? They're going to say, yeah, you know, acid rain was a huge thing. It was an environmental issue that was widespread in the US and Europe. There's a lot they heard about it, right? Ultimately, it is caused by sulfur dioxide, right, and nitrous oxides, these different pollutants, right, that are part of air pollution that got put up into the atmosphere and reacts with everything up there, makes the rain more acidic. It comes down as acid rain. And why is that such a bad thing? Well, it sucks nutrients out of the soil, right? It destroys the soil, which will kill everything that depends on the soil, like trees, and then all the animals that depends on the tree, you know, aren't able to make homes and find habitats, right? You know, these cascading effects of environmental damages, right? Or other ways that this would be seen, right? You have acid rain, and it decreases the pH of a certain water until the fish can no longer comfortably live in it, and you have these, you know, mass die-offs of fish, right? This was definitely a problem, and more specifically, right, since this was ultimately generated by coal power plants, especially areas where you had, you know, really dense industrialization, really dense power plants, right, and people living closely together, densely populated, would have much more major issues with this, right? So the northeastern United States, like up through Pennsylvania, right, and coal territory and power plant territory up there, and through Europe, which is very densely populated, right? Ultimately, I'll move myself out of the way here so you can read that. Pause if you need to. This was solved through a system known as cap and trade, right? Which is a sort of public-private way of solving it. It was really effective for this specific problem. Whether it works for other problems remains to be seen, right? But essentially, it worked like this. So the federal government, right, issues a set number of allowances, right? And says, okay, you know, people need energy, right? They're going to pollute, but we're going to set limits on how much can be polluted, right? So we're going to issue 1,000 allowances to different companies, right? And the companies bid for those allowances. They say, okay, well, we make this much money and, pollute this much, so we can pay, this amount, right, for these different allowances, right? And okay, maybe we can pay a little bit more, and then we'll pollute a little bit more, but we'll make way more profit, right? So they're going through those calculations from their individual standpoint and incentives as they do, right? And they bid for those allowances and they're auctioned off, right? And, this company has 100 of them and this company has 10 and this other company has 500, right? And they bid to figure out how much that's actually going to be worth, right? And if a company emits more than what they have in terms of allowances, then they got to pay for it, right? They got to pay a lot to, clean up the pollution, clean up the damage that they did. This should say companies, sorry. Companies that emit less, though, than what they were allowed to, right? If they bought too many permits and then they didn't end up polluting that much, or, somebody came along with this really genius system to, produce just as much energy, but without the pollution, right? They innovated something. Then they can sell extra allowances to other companies, right? Who might have gone over, right? And part of the reason why this works is that there is an absolute limit set by the number of allowances on how much pollution there is, right? So there's 1,000 allowances, and each allowance, lets a company emit 100 pounds of whatever pollutant, right? So there is a maximum limit in terms of how much pollution can go out, and total number of allowances goes down over time, right? Which strongly encourages all of these companies to find ways to deal with their own pollution. And as a result of this policy, right, acid rain has been pretty much eliminated. It's never going to be gone totally, right? But it was a successful environmental policy. Now, whether this can work for other stuff, like carbon and carbon offsets and carbon credits, is a question I'm going to set aside. We'll come back to it when we do alternative energy, right? But it's something worth looking at. All right. Big questions. Trade, comparative advantage, opportunity cost, applications of these things, right? If you, launch a missile at a library, you have destroyed wealth. It's not a zero-sum game. There can be winners. There can be both losers, right? Broken windows and why that's not actually very smart, right? Collective action, right? So the tragedy of the commons, how that leads to a collective action problem, why it's a problem, how that problem was solved, and how that applies to pollution, right? Those international case studies, right? Montreal Protocol, Paris Climate, and the Convention on Biodiversity, right? What problems they were trying to solve, who entered into them, how they have tried to solve that problem, and, what does success look like? It's the important question, right? And finally, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and then cap and trade as a way of addressing acid rain in all of our laws here in the U.S., and we've done it.